Close your eyes and breathe slowly. Let the weight of the day settle and fade and go still. Imagine England in the middle of the 18th century, a kingdom humming with ambition and industry. Wheel mills turning along gray rivers, ships, hundreds of them, carrying the full weight of empire across every ocean on earth. The streets of London alive with the clatter of carriage wheels on cobblestone, with the cries of merchants and the slow turning of printing presses, which spun out newspapers that ordinary people read by candlelight, arguing over a world that was changing faster than anyone could fully hold in their minds. This was Georgian England, an age of invention and contradiction, of grand country estates and grinding urban poverty, of scientific societies debating the nature of electricity, while surgeons still bled their patients with leeches. A time when an island nation of fewer than 8 million souls held trade routes stretching from the Korean to Calcutta, from Hudson Bay to the Malabar coast. And at the center of it all, there was a king, not a distant ceremonial figure, but a man who cared deeply and perhaps too much about what was planted in the soil, about the debts accumulating in the ledgers of his treasury, about the loyalty of people he had never met and would never see. His name was George III. He would reign for 60 years, longer than any British monarch before him. He reformed agriculture across his kingdom, personally championing crop rotation and selective breeding at his own model farm at Windsor, earning from his people the affectionate nickname Farmer George. Under his reign, the Royal Navy grew to a dominance it had never known before, hundreds of warships commanding the sea lanes of a globe-spanning empire. And yet, he lost America. He watched 13 colonies built over generations of British lives and British treasure declare themselves a free and sovereign nation. He faced a mysterious illness that stripped him, slowly and cruelly, of reason, of sight, and finally of memory itself. What drives a dutiful king toward madness as his empire fractures across the ocean? What remains of a monarch when the crown itself becomes too heavy to carry? This is the story of King George III, a man of sincere devotion and tragic limitation, a farmer at heart, ruling a world on fire. Settle in. Let the story come to you. Suggest topics for new videos in the comments and subscribe to the channel. Sleep stories, sleep dream are released here every day. He came into the world too soon. On the 4th of June, 1738, in the candlelit rooms of Norfolk House in St. James's Square, London, a child was born before his time, small, fragile, so small that those gathered in the corridor beyond the birthing chamber whispered their fears to one another in low, careful voices. They were not certain he would survive the night. His name was George William Frederick, eldest son of Frederick, Prince of Wales, and Augusta of Saxe-Gotha. In that first hour of his life before the world had found a use for him, he did not yet know what had been quietly prepared for him. The physicians wrapped the infant close to warmth and watched for the rise and fall of his chest. And the chest did rise, unevenly at first, but it rose. The boy who would one day command the largest empire on earth had begun his life by simply, without drama, refusing to stop breathing. For the first 12 years of his life, George was not destined for the throne. His grandfather, King George II, wore the crown. His father, Frederick, stood next in line. George was simply a boy growing up in the subdued world of Leicester House, The London residence where the Prince of Wales held court, always a degree outside the warmth of the official palace. Frederick was a complicated man. He and his father, King George II, shared a bitter and public enmity that made political gossip a reliable sport among the London aristocracy. And yet, within his own household, Frederick was a devoted father. He took keen personal interest in the education of young George and his younger brother Edward, wanting them to understand the arts, the sciences, and the practical business of a modern kingdom. Then, without warning, on the 20th of March, 1751, Frederick fell ill with a pulmonary abscess and died. He was 44 years old. He had never become king. George was 12. He absorbed the loss of his father with a stillness that those around him would describe years later as remarkable. Not cold, not indifferent, simply contained, as though he had already learned in some unreachable part of himself that grief was a private matter. What happens to a boy of 12 when the world shifts beneath his feet? When the man who read to him and imagined for him a quiet future is simply gone, he becomes the heir, quietly, irrevocably. George was now next in line behind his aging grandfather. The preparations for kingship, which had been theoretical, became urgent. His mother, Augusta, a widow now, became fiercely protective of her son. She surrounded him with tutors of uneven quality, but sincere intent. George studied constitutional history, Latin, French, mathematics, music, and the principles of government. He was not a natural scholar in the dazzling, effortless sense. He was something rarer. He was diligent. He returned to material he did not understand and worried at it patiently until he did. Lord Bute, a Scottish nobleman with a deep philosophical temperament, became his most trusted mentor, something approaching a surrogate father. Bute impressed upon the young prince the conviction that a good king was, above all else, a moral king, that the purpose of power was not its enjoyment, but its responsible exercise. These ideas settled into George with peculiar permanence. On the 25th of October, 1760, King George II died at Kensington Palace. He was 77 years old. He collapsed alone in his private closet before the morning had properly begun, and George, 22 years of age, became King George III. He was the first monarch of the Hanoverian line born on English soil, who spoke English as his native tongue, who understood English culture not as a foreign country, but as the land that had formed him from his first breath. His opening address to Parliament declared that he gloried in the name of Britain. It was not a small thing. In the political language of 1760, it was a declaration of identity as much as of intention. He was slender, with a round face and blue eyes that appeared, depending on the light, either earnest or slightly startled, powdered wig, tailor Georgian coat, the full dress of a king. But those who attended him privately noted he was most at ease in simpler clothing, away from ceremony. He prayed every morning with sincere attention. He did not drink excessively, did not keep mistresses, did not gamble. In an age of aristocratic excess, the young king lived with a steadiness that some found admirable, and others quietly found a little dull. On the 8th of September, 1761, less than a year into his reign, he married Sophia Charlotte, a Mecklenburg Strelitz. She was 17 years old, German-born, selected through the careful machinery of royal matchmaking as a suitable Protestant consort. She arrived in England having never met her future husband. She spoke no English. He spoke no fluent German. What happened next confounded the court. They liked each other genuinely, consistently, across a marriage that would endure for more than 50 years. Through 15 children and political catastrophe and terrible illness, they remained genuinely fond of one another. Charlotte learned English with steady application. George was patient and attentive. They breakfasted together, read together, played music in the evenings. Charlotte at the piano, George on the harpsichord or the cello. And in these quiet hours, the palace felt less like a seat of power and more simply like a home. Their domestic life was, for a royal couple of the 18th century, startlingly ordinary. They moved between Buckingham House, Kew, and Windsor, with a preference for Windsor that became something close to a calling. Windsor had land, open air, and the smell of soil. And it was at Windsor that the king, who would be remembered for losing an empire, first revealed the truest contours of his character, because George III was, at his core, a farmer. This was not a whim or an aristocratic affectation. It was a genuine and lifelong passion, rooted in the same moral seriousness that governed everything else about him. He believed the land was the foundation of a nation's health, and agriculture, not a lesser science, but a central one. And so he did what very few monarchs have thought to do. He got his hands dirty at Windsor. He established his model farm, a working agricultural estate, where he personally oversaw experiments in crop rotation, soil enrichment, and selective animal breeding. He corresponded with the leading agricultural thinkers of his era and studied the publications of the new agricultural societies transforming the English countryside. He was particularly devoted to his merino, sheep, imported from Spain, fine-woollied, bred with careful systematic attention. He tracked bloodlines and fleece quality with the same precision a general might give to troop positions. He walked among them in the early mornings, plain coat and sturdy boots, and the farm workers who witnessed him noted that he seemed more at ease in that field than anywhere else in his world. His subjects noticed. They called him Farmer George. It was not mockery. It was something closer to love, recognition that beneath the ermine and the proclamations, there was a man who simply valued good soil, healthy animals, and the honest satisfaction of a well-managed harvest. And yet, the same sincerity that made him a beloved farmer made him, in the political arena, a figure of considerable friction. George came to the throne with a fixed conviction that the monarchy had been stripped of its proper authority during the long decades of Whig dominance. The great Whig families had managed Parliament through patronage and faction until the crown had become something closer to a ceremonial function than a governing force. He intended to change this. He was not seeking absolute power. He was seeking, in his earnest and inflexible way, a king who governed as well as reigned, who chose his own ministers rather than simply ratifying the choices of parliamentary factions. This brought him almost immediately into conflict with the Whig grandees. The Duke of Newcastle, who had managed patronage networks across Parliament for a generation, found himself facing a young king not interested in being managed. George dismissed Newcastle and appointed Lord Bute as Prime Minister, a choice deeply unpopular with Parliament. which distrusted Bute as a Scottish royal favorite without sufficient experience. The critics were not entirely wrong. Bute resigned within a year. What followed was a prolonged and grinding period of ministerial instability. George worked through prime ministers in search of one who could both manage Parliament and honor his vision of active royal authority. William Pitt the Elder, brilliant architect of Britain's global strategy in the 7 Years' War, entered and exited the picture with characteristic drama. Pitt was a man of towering ability and equally towering ego, prone to intervals of profound mental collapse, and holding views on the American colonies that placed him in direct opposition to the king. These early years were not a period of grand drama. They were something more grinding and more instructive. A young king, sincere and stubborn in equal measure, learning the brutal arithmetic of political power, that devotion to principle was not the same as the ability to govern, and that the men around him were not servants of the crown, but players in a game that had been running long before his birth. He was learning. With the same patience he brought to his merino flock and his rows of experimental crops in the Windsor soil. He was learning what it meant to rule a world that was already beginning, in ways not yet visible, to crack beneath the surface. The 7 Years' War had been, in almost every measurable sense, the largest conflict the world had ever seen. It had touched every corner of the globe, fought in the forests of North America, on the rivers of India, across the plains of Europe, and on the open waters of the Atlantic and the Pacific. Men had died in the heat of Bengal and in the snow of Silesia. Flags had changed over cities that most of the men fighting beneath them had never seen on any map. And when it ended in 1763, with the signing of the Treaty of Paris, Britain stood at the summit of something extraordinary, something that had never quite existed before in the long history of the world. The terms of that treaty were staggering. France surrendered Canada, the vast, cold, forested expanse of an entire continent's northern territory. Florida came from Spain. Islands in the Caribbean were won and exchanged. And in India, that ancient, labyrinthine, and almost incomprehensibly wealthy subcontinent, the East India Company had become something more than a trading house. It had become a sovereign power in all but name, its soldiers controlling territory larger than most European kingdoms, its officials collecting taxes from millions of people who had never heard the name of the young king sitting on the throne in London. George was 24 years old when the treaty was signed. 24, and the ruler of an empire that stretched from the frozen lakes of Hudson Bay to the monsoon coasts of Bengal. He stood at the window of his private study and looked out over the quiet gardens, and one might ask, what does it feel like at 24 to govern the world? It seems like an obligation, not triumph, not elation. George was not a man given to elation. He was a man given to duty, and duty in the spring of 1763 meant sitting down with his advisors and confronting a number that would define the remainder of his reign more completely than any battlefield victory. The national debt of Great Britain stood at approximately 130 million pounds. Let that settle for a moment. 130 million pounds. In an era when a skilled tradesman earned perhaps £30 a year, when the entire annual revenue of the crown in peacetime could barely service the interest on what had been borrowed. The 7 Years' War had been won, but it had been won on credit, financed by merchants and banking houses that expected repayment, by treasury bills and government bonds that accumulated interest with the quiet indifference of the tide. The question George and his ministers faced in those years following the peace was brutally simple. Where does the money come from? British taxpayers were already carrying a burden grown heavier with each year of the war. Raising domestic taxes further would be politically catastrophic. There was another option, one that seemed, to the men who proposed it, not only reasonable but manifestly just. The American colonies, 13 colonies, stretched along the eastern seaboard of North America, from Massachusetts in the north to Georgia in the south. They were populous, prosperous, and growing with an energy that astonished every European observer. They were, by any accounting, the primary beneficiaries of the 7 Years' War. It had been fought largely to protect them. The French had been expelled from Canada at enormous cost. Tens of thousands of British soldiers had died in American forests and American summers so that these colonies could flourish without the shadow of French imperial ambition over them, and they paid. In taxes, almost nothing. An American colonist in 1763 paid a fraction of what a British subject at home paid. A fraction so small it barely appeared in the Treasury's calculations. The disparity had simply never mattered enough to address. But now the debt existed. The soldiers on the frontier still had to be fed and paid, and the question could no longer be deferred. George did not invent the idea of taxing the colonies. It came from George Grenville, who became First Lord of the Treasury in 1763, and who approached the public finances with the blunt precision of an accountant rather than the instinct of a statesman. Grenville looked at the debt, looked at the colonies, and drew the connection with what appeared to him as perfect, unassailable logic. The Stamp Act of 1765 was the result. It was not, by any objective measure, a heavy tax. It required a revenue stamp affixed to legal documents, newspapers, pamphlets, almanacs, and playing cards. Grenville explained patiently to Parliament that the act was designed not to burden the colonists unduly, but to ask them to contribute a fair share toward the cost of their own protection. The colonists disagreed. They disagreed with a fury that astonished everyone in London, including the king, not merely on the question of the amount, which was genuinely small, but on the fundamental constitutional principle beneath it. No taxation without representation. The idea was already burning in taverns from Boston to Charleston, in meeting halls from Philadelphia to Williamsburg. The colonists acknowledged the crown. They celebrated the king's birthday. But they had their own assemblies, their own elected members, their own long tradition of voting on the taxes they would pay. And Parliament, that distant body in Westminster in which no American voice was ever heard, had no right, they insisted, to impose a tax upon them. The protest began with pamphlets and petitions. Then came boycotts of British goods, organized with a disciplined London had not anticipated. British manufacturers, seeing their American markets contract with alarming speed, petitioned Parliament with urgent concern. The Stamp Act was repealed in 1766, but its repeal came paired with a declaratory act, a firm assertion that Britain retained the absolute right to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever, a compromise that satisfied no one. The Townshend Acts of 1767 imposed new duties on glass, paper, paint, and tea. The response was the same: outrage, boycotts, colonial assemblies passing resolutions of defiance that grew more confident with each repetition. And then there was Boston. Boston was where the words began to harden into physical encounter. The city had always been the most politically charged of the colonial centers, densely populated, commercially alive, and possessed of a civic culture that treated argument and resistance as twin virtues. When British troops were stationed there in 1768 to enforce customs regulations, the presence of armed soldiers on civilian streets became itself a permanent provocation. The streets of Boston in those years were charged with an electricity you could feel in the packed meetings at Faneuil Hall, where men like Samuel Adams spoke in voices, carrying both the weight of constitutional argument and the heat of something older and less patient. You could feel it in the daily confrontations between soldiers and apprentices, between customs officials and merchants who saw these new regulations as an assault on everything they had built. In the winter of 1770, it finally broke. A crowd gathered near the customs house on King Street on a cold March evening. Words were exchanged. Objects were thrown. The soldiers, outnumbered and frightened, fired into the crowd. 5 men died. Paul Revere's engraving of the scene, deliberately composed, politically calibrated, spread through the colonies like flame across dry grass. The Boston Massacre was not a planned military action. It was a night of confusion and fear that ended in blood. But its meaning was fixed the moment the smoke cleared. George received the reports from across the Atlantic with a heaviness that settled in him and did not lift easily. He was entering his 31st year. The round face of his youth had acquired new lines. The open sincerity that his early portraits had captured was giving way to something more guarded and more worn. The weight of an empire and argument with itself arrived not as abstraction, but in dispatches and parliamentary debates and in the anxious faces of ministers who brought him news they would have preferred to deliver to someone else. The world was shifting beneath his feet. The empire he had inherited, so brilliantly expanded by the war just concluded, so expensively maintained, was beginning to speak to him in a language he had not been taught. Not the language of treaties or royal prerogative, something older. The language of people who had decided without fully understanding it themselves that they were no longer willing to be told what they were or what they owed, or who had the right to define the terms of their existence. The thunder was still distant, but it was growing closer with every passing season. And the king, no longer quite so young, stood watching the horizon and waiting for the storm he could not prevent and could not yet bring himself to fully imagine. The thunder had arrived, not slowly, not with further warning, but all at once, on an April morning in 1775, on a village green in Massachusetts, Lexington, then Concord. A bridge over a narrow river. Farmers and tradesmen, men who repaired their own boots and knew the names of their neighbors' children, standing with muskets against the professional soldiers of the British Crown. They did not break. The regulars withdrew, and the sound of those first shots traveled across the Atlantic in the weeks that followed and arrived. Finally, in the private rooms of a king who had hoped, with genuine sincerity, that it would not come to this. George was 36 years old. He had been king for 15 years. He had spent the better part of the last decade establishing what he believed was a reasonable, legitimate principle that Parliament had the authority to legislate for every part of the British Empire, including the colonies across the ocean. It was not, to his mind, an unusual position. It was the bedrock of the constitutional order he had sworn to uphold. He had watched the colonists resist that principle through protests and boycotts, through the burning of customs houses and the tarring and feathering of royal officials. He had watched and waited and hoped that patience would restore order that it had not. What drives a man to refuse the very independence his own failures made inevitable? Not arrogance entirely, not simple pride. In George's case, it was something older and more sincere, a conviction that ran down to the marrow of his bones that the British Empire was not merely a commercial arrangement. It was an ordered world, a hierarchy of obligation, of protection, of shared identity. To permit a part of it to separate was not a policy adjustment. It was a moral catastrophe, and George could not commit moral catastrophes and remain the man he had always struggled to be. And so, in the autumn of 1775, he addressed Parliament and declared the colonies to be in a state of rebellion. He spoke of traitors. He spoke of the duty of loyal subjects to return to obedience. Beneath the formal language was something very human and very frightened, a man who understood, perhaps better than he admitted, that he stood at the edge of something vast and irreversible, and could not yet bring himself to step back. The early years of the conflict carried from London a deceptive quality of manageability. General Howe took New York in 1776. Cornwallis pursued Washington's exhausted forces across New Jersey in the bitter cold of late autumn. Philadelphia fell in 1777. The reports reaching George's desk sometimes carried the quiet optimism of men who believed the worst might soon be over. But Saratoga came. General Burgoyne had marched south through the great northern wilderness with more than 6,000 men and a certainty that matched his ambition. He expected to split the colonies and end the war. What he had not accounted for was the terrain, the supply lines, and the Continental regulars under Horatio Gates, who waited for him with a patience he had not expected. On the 17th of October, 1777, Burgoyne laid down his sword. More than 5,000 British soldiers surrendered in the October cold. It was the largest British military capitulation, and living memory. George received the report in his study. He set it down very carefully on the desk. He sat with it for a long time, in a silence that his servants had learned to leave undisturbed. He sat with it because he understood what it meant beyond the immediate military reckoning. What does it cost a man to direct a war across 3,000 miles of open ocean? The dispatches came slowly. Orders sent in October arrived in January, already obsolete. The battles being fought on a morning in Virginia had already been won or lost before any instruction from London could hope to reach the men fighting them. George wrote and read and corrected and replied, but the ocean swallowed time, and time was the one resource an empire at war could not afford to lose. He slept badly. He returned to his desk before dawn on mornings when the news had been heavy. He wrote to his ministers with a frightening consistency, repeating a single, unyielding conviction: the colonies must be held. Concessions were weakness. Weakness invited dissolution. He prayed each morning and played his flute badly in the evenings and walked in the gardens at Kew with his wife Charlotte, speaking to her in a quietness she had learned over the years to interpret as the language of a man carrying more than he could. Articulate, and the war grew larger. Saratoga had been visible from Versailles. France had watched the American conflict with the patient interest of a creditor observing a rival stumble toward bankruptcy. The humiliations of the 7 Years' War, the loss of Canada, of strategic territories across the Caribbean had never fully healed. Saratoga was the proof the French court had been waiting for. In February of 1778, France formally recognized the United States of America and entered into a military alliance with the new republic. The nature of the war changed entirely in the space of a single diplomatic document. Spain followed in 1779, attacking British positions at Gibraltar and in the Caribbean. The Dutch Republic, worn down by British interference with its merchant shipping, declared against Britain in 1780. What had begun as a colonial police action was now a global war, fought across the Atlantic Ocean, the Caribbean Sea, the coasts of Europe, and the waters of the Indian Ocean. The Royal Navy had always been Britain's foundational advantage, the deep, ancient certainty that the sea was British. Now, French warships engaged British squadrons with a coordination and resolve they had never previously achieved. Admiral Rodney won a significant engagement at the Battle of the Saints in 1782, recovering something of what had been surrendered in Caribbean waters. But the timing was already too late to alter the outcome on the American mainland. By the autumn of 1781, Cornwallis had gathered nearly 8,000 men at Yorktown on the Virginia coast and was waiting for resupply by the Royal Navy. The Navy did not come. The French fleet under the Comte de Grasse met the British ships at the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay on the 5th of September, 1781. The engagement was not long. When the British withdrew, damaged and unable to break through, Yorktown was sealed. Washington and Rochambeau moved their combined forces south with extraordinary speed. The siege guns opened their steady, methodical work. The earthworks fell one by one, and on the 19th of October, 1781, in a field in Virginia, with a band playing a tune called The World Turned Upside Down, Cornwallis surrendered his army. He sent a deputy to the ceremony, citing illness. Whether the illness was of the body or the spirit, his contemporaries never agreed. The news reached London in late November. Lord North, who had carried the Prime Minister's ship through the entire terrible arc of this war, received the dispatch and said, quite simply, "It is all over." He paced the room. He repeated it. "It is all over." George did not say that. George sat with the reports and wrote in his own hand a draft of an abdication message, a composed document acknowledging that, given the failure of the American war, his people might reasonably wish for different leadership. He wrote it carefully. He folded it neatly. He placed it in a drawer. He did not send it. He could not surrender. Not because of vanity, though there was vanity in it. Not because of habit, though 20 years on a throne carve grooves that run very deep. But because George had always understood his kingship as a covenant accepted before God, in a ceremony he could still recall with precision that surprised him when it surfaced in quiet moments. A covenant could not be resigned on the basis of personal failure. without becoming a different kind of failure entirely. He had been given this. He would hold it. The peace negotiations moved through 1782 and into 1783 with the slow, grinding logic of exhausted powers seeking a tolerable conclusion. Benjamin Franklin sat in Paris and negotiated with a patience and shrewdness the British delegation found, alternately, admirable and infuriating. The turns assembled themselves piece by piece in long sessions in lamplit rooms, while outside the city of Paris continued its ordinary life, indifferent to the magnitude of what was being decided. In September of 1783, the treaty was signed. Britain recognized the independence of the United States of America. The territories east of the Mississippi River, from the Great Lakes to the northern border of Florida, passed from British sovereignty into American hands. An empire had given birth to a nation it had never intended to create. George did not attend the signing. It was at Kew in the early autumn. The trees in the walled gardens had begun to turn, the particular golds and ambers of the English September, the air carrying that cool clarity which arrives at the end of summer, like a quiet acknowledgment that something is ending. He was 45 years old. He had been king for 23 years. He had lost an ocean. He sat very still for a long time. The dispatches lay on the desk beside him, and the routine forms of government that continued regardless of what, across the water, had just been concluded and sealed. Somewhere outside the tall windows, a bird called once, clearly, and then was silent. He reached for his pen. He drew the next paper from the pile, and he began to read. The pen moved. The papers continued to arrive, and he continued to read them. The years passed, 1784, 85, 86, and in the quiet machinery of governance, George found something that resembled steadiness. He rode his estates at Windsor. He rose early. He ate sparingly. He was a king who valued routine above almost everything else, and routine, in those middle years, was what held him together. But something was building beneath the surface of those ordered days. Something no amount of routine could contain. It began in the summer of 1788, and it began quietly, as the most terrible things often do. He was 50 years old. A heavier man now than the slender, round-faced young king who had taken the throne nearly 3 decades before, the face fuller, the complexion more florid, the lines carved deeper by time and loss, and the weight of a reign that had broken more than it had built. He had survived the loss of the American colonies. He had survived Pitt and Fox and a dozen political catastrophes that would have felled lesser men. He believed in those quiet summer months that he had reached some kind of equilibrium. He had not. It began as cramping, a persistent discomfort in the legs and abdomen that he dismissed, as he dismissed most physical complaints, with a brisk determination not to be troubled by it. He rose, he dressed, he conducted his audiences, but the cramping worsened, and with it came something else, a rapid, pressured quality to his speech that those around him noticed first. A torrent of words tumbling without pause, without breath, as though something inside him had been wound too tightly and was now unwinding all at once. What does a man feel in those first hours of losing the anchor of his own mind? Not madness, perhaps. Not yet. Something more terrifying than madness, because he could still see himself. From some receding interior distance, he could still observe what was happening, and he could not stop it. By October of 1788, the symptoms had become impossible to conceal. His eyes were inflamed and strange. His urine had turned a dark port wine color. He complained of weakness in his arms. He could not sleep. When he did sleep, he woke from dreams he would not describe. His speech became a continuous cascade. He spoke for hours to courtiers, to servants, about nothing and everything, repeating himself, circling back, unable to find the end of his own sentences. At Windsor, the household moved around him with the careful, deliberate quiet of people who understood something was very wrong and did not yet know what to do. His physicians were called. They were men of their age, and the 18th century's understanding of the mind and its failures was not understanding at all. It was fear dressed in Latin. They bled him. They purged him. They applied emetics that left him convulsing, his body's remaining dignity stripped away by the very men supposed to restore him. What does it mean to watch a king become unreachable? For Queen Charlotte, who had shared his bed and his quiet evenings for 26 years, it meant something that had no name in the vocabulary of the time. She watched him become a stranger inside his own face. The man she had known, steady, dutiful, fundamentally kind, was dissolving before her, and the dissolution was not peaceful. He was moved to Kew. The move was presented as convalescence, as rest. It was in truth a form of containment. The physicians who attended him there disagreed about nearly everything except one point, that the King of Great Britain was, by any reasonable definition, mad. The word was circled, retreated from, replaced with more palatable terms: derangement, indisposition, fever of the brain. But the reality was plain to everyone who saw him. He mistook members of his household for people dead for years. He delivered long speeches to empty rooms. On at least one occasion he was found outdoors in the winter cold, in conversation with an oak tree, addressing it as though it were a visiting ambassador, and then the treatments that followed were not treatments at all. They were punishment. Dr. Francis Willis arrived at Kew in December of 1788. He ran an institution for the mentally afflicted in Lincolnshire, and his methods were shaped not by compassion, but by a theory of control. Willis believed madness could be mastered through discipline, and discipline meant something very specific. When the king became agitated, Willis had him placed in a restraining chair. When he struck out, a straitjacket was applied. When he refused to submit, Willis applied blistering, the raising of welts on the skin through caustic substances, to draw what the theory of the day called poisonous humors outward from the mind. What does a man born a king feel when he is strapped to a chair by a physician from Lincolnshire? He fought, he raged, he pleaded. On his clearer days he wept, and told Willis with terrible lucidity that he knew what was being done to him, and knew it was wrong, and could not stop it. This knowing, this residual, tormented awareness, was perhaps the cruelest part of his suffering. While the king endured this in the cold rooms at Kew, something else was happening at Westminster. The question of what to do when a king could not rule was not one the British Constitution had answered with any clarity. The Prince of Wales, George's eldest son, 26 years old, already estranged, already deep in debt, wanted the regency completely, without restriction, without conditions, as though his father were already dead and buried. William Pitt the Younger was determined this would not happen. Pitt understood exactly what an unrestricted regency under the prince would mean. Fox and the Whigs would return to power, his government would fall, and everything built since 1783 would be dismantled. The Regency crisis of 1788 to 1789 became one of the bitterest parliamentary contests of the century. Pitt proposed strict limitations on the Regency, the prince to be restricted in his powers, the king's household to remain with Queen Charlotte. Fox, in the most spectacular reversal of his usual positions, argued for the prince's absolute right, a stance so nakedly contradicted by everything he had ever argued about, parliamentary supremacy, that even his allies noticed. Bills were drafted, amended, argued with the furious energy of men who had everything to gain or lose. The country watched, anxious, as uncertain winter dragged through its weeks, holding a complicated, genuine affection for the strange and conscientious king who was somewhere at Kew, lost to them. And then in February of 1789, something happened that no one had planned for. He began to recover. It came gradually, not as a clean reversal, but as a slow, unsteady return, the mind reassembling itself piece by piece from the wreckage of the preceding months. His speech slowed. His eyes cleared. He asked coherent questions. He recognized people he had not recognized in weeks. He walked in the gardens at Kew with something approaching his old purposeful stride, and the physicians who had blistered him and strapped him to chairs took credit for the improvement with the unself-conscious confidence of men whose theory had room for everything and explained nothing. By the end of February, it was clear. The king was recovered. Not entirely. He was slower, quieter, more easily fatigued. But he was present. He was himself. The Regency bill, advancing steadily toward passage, was quietly shelved. The Prince of Wales retreated to his creditors and grievances. Fox returned to opposition. Pitt remained precisely where he had always intended to remain, and across the kingdom, the relief was extraordinary. Church bells rang in every county. Bonfires were lit on hillsides. Illuminations were hung from windows in cities and market towns and villages whose inhabitants had never seen their king and never would. There were services of thanksgiving in St. Paul's Cathedral and in 1,000 smaller churches whose names no one remembers now. The streets of London filled with people celebrating the return of a man, a particular, familiar, eccentric, conscientious man who had been, for those terrible months, lost. George attended the Thanksgiving service at St. Paul's in April of 1789. He rode through the streets of London in the spring light, and the crowds were immense and loud and genuinely moved. He was 50 years old. He had endured something no vocabulary of the time could fully name, and he had come back from it. The people who saw his face in that carriage, older, quieter, the eyes carrying something new and unreadable, felt, without being able to say why, that they were looking at a man who had been somewhere very dark and returned, and who would never be entirely the same. He raised his hand. The bells were ringing, and the bonfires burned on the far hills, and the spring air carried something, relief, the particular quality of a day when the worst feared thing has for now not come to pass. He was their king. He was present, and for this bright April morning that was enough. The spring of 1789 had barely settled over England when the world across the Channel began, very quietly and then very suddenly, to come apart. It had seemed at first like something that might correct itself. A financial crisis in France, a king struggling with debt, and a population grown tired of carrying it. Louis XVI had called the Estates General in May of that year, the first time in 175 years, and there was talk that reform might be possible, that the old monarchies might bend just slightly and survive. George did not share this optimism. He had seen what revolutions looked like in miniature. He had watched the American colonies break away, the certainty of empire dissolve, and there was something in the language coming out of Paris, in the pamphlets and the gathering crowds, that reminded him of a fire contained too long in too small a space. By July of 1789, the fire had broken its walls. The storming of the Bastille on the 14th of July sent a shock through every royal court in Europe that cannot be easily overstated. It was not simply a riot. It was not even simply a rebellion. It was a statement made in blood and stone that the old arrangements between those who ruled and those who were ruled were no longer sufficient. The fortress fell. The prisoners were released, and across Europe the crowned heads of the continent felt, for the first time in a very long time, genuinely afraid. At Windsor, George received the dispatches from his ministers with the particular stillness of a man who has already learned to absorb terrible things without flinching. He had returned from his own darkness only months earlier, and now the world was asking him to be steady again, to be the fixed point against which everything else was permitted to move, and he was. That was what George III was built for. He had never been brilliant in the way his advisers were brilliant. He had never possessed the cold, strategic genius of a Pitt, nor the rhetorical fire of a Fox. But he had something else, a deep, almost geological steadiness, a refusal to be swept away by the currents that were sweeping almost everything else. Where other monarchies wavered and crumbled, George held. He believed with every fiber of a profoundly religious man that his duty was not to flourish or to shine, but simply to endure. The events in France accelerated with a velocity that left Europe breathless. Louis XVI, a fellow sovereign, a man who had supported the American Revolution and found himself unable to survive the debt of it, was arrested in 1792. He was tried before the National Convention in December of that year. He was convicted, and on the 21st of January, 1793, he was brought to the Place de la Révolution in Paris, and the blade of the guillotine came down. The execution of Louis XVI arrived in the British court with something beyond horror. A king had been tried, convicted, and publicly executed by his own people, not in secret, not in battle, but through a deliberate process designed to strip him of everything, including the dignity of dying as a monarch. The message was not subtle. Kingship itself was not sacred. Any king in any country could be unmade. George withdrew from public engagements for a period of mourning, but the effect on his public function was profound and lasting. He became something no political calculation could manufacture, a genuine symbol, not of power precisely, but of continuity, of the possibility that the world could hold its shape. What does a people reach for when everything familiar begins to break? They reach for what remains. And what remained in Britain was George. He was 50 years old, not young, not glamorous. He had survived a catastrophic illness of the mind. He had lost America. He had weathered crises that would have undone men of lesser persistence. But he was there. He had been there for 30 years, and in a world suddenly consuming kings at a horrifying rate, this simple, stubborn presence became something remarkable. He was the king. He was still there. And for hundreds of thousands of ordinary British men and women watching the reports from France, that was enough that the threat did not remain theoretical for long. Napoleon Bonaparte emerged from the chaos of revolutionary France with a speed no one had anticipated. He was a military mind of a kind that had not appeared in Europe in a generation. Precise, visionary, ferociously ambitious. By 1796, he was commanding the French army in Italy, winning battles that should not have been winnable. By 1799, he had seized control of the French government in the coup of the 18th Brumaire. Whatever the revolution had promised, it was now, in practical terms, his Britain was at war. It had been at war since 1793. The Navy was stretched across the globe. The Army was mobilizing on a scale the country had not seen in a generation. William Pitt, the younger, was driving the country forward through financial genius and sheer willpower. The threat of invasion was not rhetorical. Napoleon had described England as a nation of shopkeepers, and he fully intended to close the shop. George understood the nature of the moment. He visited encampments. He reviewed troops in the field, riding among the men with formality softened by genuine attention. He corresponded with his ministers in his careful, methodical hand. He was a man in his mid-50s now, the face heavier, the powdered wig a formal armor. When there was talk of negotiating with Napoleon, George refused. There would be no peace that handed France the shape of victory. It was in this atmosphere of existential threat that the question of Ireland became impossible to ignore any longer. Ireland had always been a complicated wound in the side of British governance. It had its own parliament in Dublin, but that parliament existed within a relationship with Westminster that satisfied almost no one. Irish Catholics were excluded from full political participation. The Anglo-Irish Protestant ascendancy was a minority governing a majority. The French Revolution had given the dispossessed a new vocabulary. The United Irishmen, led by Theobald Wolfe Tone, who had traveled to Paris to beg French support, were organizing with a seriousness that could not be dismissed. The rebellion came in 1790-8. It was brutal and desperate and ultimately unsuccessful. The United Irishmen rose in May, and the British response was swift and savage. There was fighting in Wexford and Antrim and Mayo, where a small French expeditionary force actually landed in August, a nightmarish confirmation of what Pitt had feared. The rebellion was suppressed. Thousands died, and what remained was a question that could not be postponed. What was to be done with Ireland? Pitt's answer was the Act of Union, if Ireland were formally united with Britain. If the Parliament of Ireland were dissolved and its members seated at Westminster, the country could be governed as a coherent whole. The Catholic majority could, in time, be granted full political rights, because in a united legislature they would be a manageable minority. The threat of French manipulation through Irish discontent would be neutralized. The political maneuvering required was extraordinary in complexity and frank cynicism. The Irish Parliament had to vote itself out of existence. Members were persuaded, pressured, and, in some cases, openly purchased. Peerages were created. Government positions were offered. Constituencies were retired. It moved slowly and then all at once, through 1799 and into 1800. On the 1st of January, 1801, the Act of Union came into force at the Kingdom of Great Britain, itself the product of the union with Scotland in 1707, merged with the Kingdom of Ireland to become the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. A new Union flag was adopted, incorporating the red diagonal cross of St. Patrick, alongside the cross of St. George and the cross of St. Andrew. The Irish Parliament in Dublin met for the last time and dissolved itself into history. George III became the first sovereign of the new United Kingdom, a kingdom encompassing the entire British Isles under a single crown. He was 62 years old. He had been king for 40 years. He had lived through the loss of America, through revolution, through the execution of kings, through rebellion and war and the most intimate darkness of his own mind. And now, in the first cold days of a new century, he stood at the head of a kingdom that was the most consequential thing his long reign had yet produced. The Union was imperfect from the beginning. The Catholic emancipation that Pitt had promised and that George opposed with a rigidity rooted in his reading of his coronation oath. His belief that granting full rights to Catholics would violate his sworn duty to uphold the Protestant Constitution was not delivered. Pitt resigned in February of 1801, bitterly disappointed. Ireland, brought into the Union without the concession that might have made it bearable, began almost immediately to resist it, but the United Kingdom existed. It was real. It bore his name, and it would carry that name long after he was gone. And in the long, complicated chronicle of this quiet, stubborn man, that was a fact that would not be unmade. What remained for him now was what had always remained: the duty, the presence, the simple, costly, daily act of continuing. He had held while the world broke around him, and he would go on holding for as long as holding remained possible. That was who he was. That was the only answer he had ever really known how to give. What does a man become when the darkness is no longer temporary? When the mind that held an empire begins to slip beyond reach, and the body that carried duty for 6 decades finally surrenders to the weight it has borne? In the autumn of 1810, the illness returned. Not the passing madness of 1788, not the brief eclipse of 1801. This time it came to stay. George was 72 years old. His youngest daughter, Amelia, was dying. The grief broke something in him that had held, barely, through revolution and war and personal humiliation. The physicians gathered again, administered their mercury and their restraints, whispered their diagnoses in the corridors of Windsor. But this time there would be no recovery. The king who had risen before had fallen for the last time. The man who had insisted on his own presence, his own duty, was now absent from the world he had shaped. What happens to a king when his senses begin to fail? When the crown remains, but the man who wears it can no longer see the faces of those who bow, can no longer hear the prayers offered in his name? By 1811, George was blind. The world he had studied so carefully, the maps he had pored over, the faces of his children, the ink on the documents he had signed with such methodical care, all of it gone. And then, slowly, cruelly, the deafness came. The voices of his attendants became distant murmurs, then silence. The music he had loved, the chamber concerts at Kew, the sound of the harpsichord he played in the evenings, faded into nothing. He lived now in a darkness that was complete, a silence that was absolute. He was the king of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, sovereign of an empire that spanned the globe, and he could not see it, could not hear it, could not know it. He was present and absent at once, a ghost in his own life. What does a man do when there is nothing left but the echo of what he was? When the days stretch endlessly and the only companions are the ones no one else can see? He played the harpsichord. In the long, empty hours at Windsor, George would sit at the instrument, his fingers finding the keys by memory, playing pieces he could no longer hear. The attendants would watch him, this old man in his white flannel dressing gown, his hair long and uncombed, his face deeply lined, playing to an audience of shadows. He spoke to people who were not there, to his mother long dead, to his lost children, to ministers who had resigned decades before. He held conversations with ghosts, arguments and reconciliations that made sense only to him. He wandered the corridors of the castle, muttering, occasionally singing hymns in a voice that cracked and wavered. The servants learned to step aside, to let him pass, to guide him gently back to his rooms when he became lost. This was the king. This was what remained. A man who had once commanded fleets and signed treaties, now unable to command even his own thoughts, his own perceptions. And yet he was still the king. The law said so. The Constitution said so. He wore the title even as the man who had earned it dissolved into confusion and darkness. What does a son do when the father can no longer rule? When duty demands that power be taken, even if love makes the taking unbearable? In 1811, Parliament passed the Regency Act. The Prince of Wales, George's eldest son, the man he had battled and despaired over for years, became Prince Regent. The power that George had held so tightly, the authority he had defended so stubbornly, passed to the son who represented everything he had feared: extravagance, self-indulgence, a court of wit and fashion and moral laxity. The Regency was everything George had tried not to be. Carlton House glittered while Windsor slept. The Prince Regent built and spent and entertained, transforming London into a showcase of Regency elegance, while his father, blind and deaf and mad, played his silent harpsichord in the shadows. The irony was almost unbearable. The careful, pious king had given way to the profligate prince, and the nation that had mocked George for his simplicity now celebrated his son for his sophistication. And George, locked in his darkness, knew nothing of it. He did not know that his son ruled in his name. He did not know that the regency he had resisted for so long had finally come. He simply continued in his own lost world, playing and speaking and wandering, until there was nothing left to continue. What is the measure of a king's life when the end comes quietly? When there are no great battles, no final speeches, only the slow fading of a man who has already been absent for years. On the 29th of January, 1820, George died at Windsor Castle. He was 81 years old. He had been king for 59 years, the longest reign in British history to that point. He had outlived most of his children. He had outlived his wife, who had died just over a year before, though he had not understood her passing. He had outlived the America he had tried to hold, the ministers who had served him, the enemies who had fought him. The man who died that winter night was not the man who had been crowned in 1761. That man, earnest and determined and terrified of failure, had been worn away by decades of duty and disappointment and disease. What remained was a shell, a body that had forgotten how to stop, a heart that had kept beating long after the mind had surrendered. The news of his death was received with a strange mixture of relief and sorrow. He had been gone so long that his actual departure felt almost anticlimactic. The regency continued without interruption. His son became George IV. The United Kingdom that bore his name moved forward into the 19th century, and the man who had held it together, who had insisted on duty when others offered only cleverness, who had been mocked and pitied, and sometimes briefly admired, was buried quietly, without the ceremony that might have been expected. He had been a footnote to his own reign for nearly a decade. Death simply made it official. What is the legacy of a man who tried so hard and failed so publicly, who gave everything to duty and watched it crumble in his hands, who held an empire together and lost the part he cared about most? George III was not a great king. He was not a wise king. He was not even by most measures a successful king. He lost America, the greatest territorial loss in British history. He presided over decades of political instability and personal humiliation. He ended his life blind, deaf, and insane, a figure of pity and ridicule. And yet, he held, through revolution and war and madness, through the collapse of ministries and the rebellion of his own children, through personal anguish that would have broken a lesser man, he held. He believed in duty. He believed in the Constitution. He believed that being king meant something more than wearing a crown, that it required sacrifice and constancy, and the daily, unglamorous act of simply showing up. He was not brilliant. He was not charismatic. But he was present. For 59 years, in sickness and in health, in sanity and in madness, he was present. And when he finally left, when the long eclipse ended and the darkness took him completely, the kingdom he left behind was not the one he had inherited. It was stronger, stranger, more complicated. It had survived the loss of America and the threat of France. It had become the United Kingdom. It had begun the transformation into the empire that would define the 19th century. George did not create that empire. He did not plan it, but he held the ground while others built it. That was his gift. That was his legacy. The simple, costly, relentless act of holding. And in the end, perhaps that was enough. Suggest topics for new videos in the comments and subscribe to the channel. Sleep stories, sleep dream are released here every day.